In 1814, the Hartwell family of Ashford Hollow, Massachusetts, stood at the pinnacle of local prominence. Their estate sprawled across 200 acres of rolling farmland, crowned by a 3-story Georgian manor whose white columns gleamed against the New England sky. The Hartwells were known as patrons of the town church, donors to the local academy, and shrewd land barons whose wealth was spoken of with both admiration and envy. Yet even as their public image shone, whispers clung to their name, rumors of instability, of sudden deaths hushed in the parish registry, of children removed quietly from view and spoken of no more. By the middle of the 19th century, townsfolk had given the family a darker epithet, the Hartwell legacy of silence. That silence was not mere rumor. Court records preserved in the Worcester County Archives reveal peculiar guardianship filings in which Hartwell heirs were declared unfit to manage property. Local physicians, writing in medical ledgers now stored in historical societies, described symptoms that defied their era's understanding. Fits of mania, unbroken, muttering through the night, obsessions with bloodlines and purity. Yet for every documented trace, there is a missing page. Journals torn from ledgers, testimonies stricken from the record, obituaries never printed. It was as if the Hartwells themselves labored to erase their own story, leaving behind fragments too chilling to ignore. Visitors to the Hartwell estate spoke of the contrast between grandeur and unease. A guest attending a summer fete in 1832 wrote of ballrooms lit with chandeliers imported from London, yet noted an air of dread in the upper corridors, where certain doors were always locked. Servants dismissed from their posts later confessed under oath in labor disputes that behind those locked doors were family members kept from public view, restrained in their chambers, their screams muffled by heavy drapes. The Hartwells insisted these were fabrications from disgruntled workers, yet the pattern of testimony across decades is difficult to dismiss. What makes the Hartwell legacy more haunting still is its intergenerational rhythm. Madness did not strike all at once, but unfolded like a curse woven into blood. A patriarch might pass his estate to his son with dignity intact, only for the grandson to spiral into delusion. Parish records from 1798 describe young Jonathan Hartwell wandering into the churchyard at midnight, muttering prayers backward until parishioners carried him home. In 1846, his niece, Margaret, once celebrated for her musical talent, was found attempting to claw her way through the plaster of her bedroom wall, convinced something was hidden inside. Each case was treated as an isolated misfortune, but taken together, they trace a chilling pattern madness that spanned generations. Yet in public, the Hartwells remained untouchable. Wealth and influence shielded them from scrutiny. Physicians who attempted to raise alarms were quietly dismissed, their reputations discredited by the very family that had hired them. One clergyman, Reverend Isaac Clark, hinted in a sermon that sins of the blood weighed heavily upon certain houses in Ashford Hollow. Within months, Clark was reassigned to a distant parish, his sermons on the Hartwells never spoken of again. Silence was the family's strongest inheritance, silence enforced through money, law, and fear. The physical landscape of Ashford Hollow still bears traces of their concealment. Old maps show carriage roads that led to smaller cottages on the far edge of the estate, structures later bricked up and forgotten. Oral tradition among locals claims these were sanctuaries, where afflicted Hartwells were confined, away from the prying eyes of neighbors. Children dared one another to creep near the boarded windows and claimed to hear weeping inside long after the buildings had been abandoned. Though folklore distorts with time, archaeological surveys have indeed uncovered iron restraints buried near those foundations, lending weight to the stories. Perhaps the most unsettling thread in the Hartwell narrative lies in the family's own writings. Fragments of diaries, preserved by accident in town archives, reveal a language steeped in obsession. One entry from 1852 reads, "The sickness runs in the marrow, and only through purity of our own kind may it be controlled." Another, unsigned but attributed to a Hartwell matriarch, confesses, "I fear what grows in the minds of my children. It is as though their thoughts are not their own, but voices of those who came before, demanding continuance. Such passages blur the line between psychiatric illness and something older, more supernatural in tone, an inheritance of memory and madness carried through blood. Neighbors, though wary, could not entirely turn away. Ashford Hollow depended on Hartwell patronage. Their mills employed dozens. Their donations funded schools. To question the family too loudly was to jeopardize livelihood. And so the town learned complicity, speaking kindly of the Hartwells in daylight while whispering of them after dark. The manor on the hill became both a beacon of prosperity and a monument to dread. Even now, historians investigating the Hartwell archives describe an uncanny sensation. Documents missing without explanation, sealed trunks found empty, probate files redacted in ink so heavy it bleeds through the paper. It is as though the Hartwells themselves reached forward through time to maintain their silence. But silence, paradoxically, leaves echoes. Every missing record, every bricked-up wing, every erased obituary deepens the mystery rather than conceals it. The story of the Hartwell bloodline begins not with a single tragedy, but with a pattern, the gradual unveiling of a madness that stretched across generations, hidden in plain sight by wealth and respectability. As we trace their history, we must follow those echoes through courtrooms, asylums, and graveyards, piecing together the fragments left behind. The question remains, was the Hartwell curse one of biology, a hereditary illness misunderstood by 19th century medicine, or was it something more elusive, a darkness rooted not only in mind but in the very soil of Ashford Hollow? The Hartwell legacy of silence is not just a chronicle of one family's decline. It is a mirror held to the lengths society will go to protect its illusions of order and propriety, even when decay festers beneath the surface. And as we move deeper into their story, we step into rooms long locked, corridors long forgotten, where the silence of the Hartwells waits to be broken. The Hartwell name first appeared in colonial records in 1692, when Thomas Hartwell, a merchant from Bristol, England, purchased a vast tract of land in what would become Ashford Hollow. To neighbors, he was a figure of respect, a man who brought order to a wild settlement, who built a church, and who endowed the fledgling town with its first schoolhouse. Yet even in those early days, shadows clung to his legacy. Court documents from Suffolk County note that Thomas's younger brother, Edward, was quietly declared unsound of mind and confined to the family's homestead. His name vanishes from public record after 1699, though locals whispered of a man seen wandering the Hartwell orchards at night, chanting in a tongue none could recognize. That disappearance set the tone for centuries of carefully concealed affliction. As the family grew in wealth, marrying into other prominent New England clans, their fortunes rose, but their private tragedies multiplied. Parish registers tell of infants baptized but never recorded as buried, their names cut off midline by a trembling pen. In 1734, a minister's notes describe visiting the Hartwell house and encountering a daughter whose fits of laughter were so violent as to shake the walls. Her name is never given, nor is her fate, but the sermon preached the following Sunday warned against the sins of blood carried forward through unrepented generations. By the Revolutionary War, the Hartwells stood among the region's wealthiest families. Colonel Nathaniel Hartwell supplied troops with arms and grain, earning both profit and prestige. But his personal letters, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, speak of a different battle within his household. In 1778, he wrote to a confidant in Boston, "My eldest son shows a disquieting mind, speaking of voices in the rafters that guide his actions. He claims the blood within him carries not only mine, but that of all who came before, urging him to deeds I dare not name." The son, Elijah, would inherit the estate, but by 1790 he had retreated entirely from public life. Local tax records still list his holdings, yet no public appearances or statements survive. It was said the manor windows were shuttered day and night, and deliveries left at the gate. Elijah's isolation gave rise to stories that the Hartwell mansion had become a place of confinement rather than hospitality. Servants dismissed from their posts carried tales of long corridors with bricked-up doorways, and of meals left outside chambers where unseen occupants whispered or sobbed. One young maid testified decades later, during an unrelated hearing, that she had carried food to the girl in the blue room, who was never allowed to leave. Whether this was exaggeration or testimony of genuine captivity, it reinforces the image of a family both powerful and deeply secretive. What made the Hartwell affliction so disturbing was its persistence across generations. Medical science of the 18th and 19th centuries did not yet recognize hereditary psychiatric disorders, but modern historians reviewing the evidence note clear patterns. Episodes of mania, depression, paranoia, and violent outbursts recur with uncanny regularity every second or third generation. Yet alongside these symptoms appear obsessions of a more unusual nature, fixations on purity of bloodline, rituals meant to cleanse the mind, and repeated references to a curse carried from the old world. The line between superstition and medicine blurred in the Hartwell household. Surviving notes from Dr. Amos Willoughby, a physician who attended the family in the early 1800 seconds, describe treatments involving both mercury and prayer. One entry notes, "The matriarch requests Holy Writ be read aloud during bleeding, for she believes the affliction is not of flesh alone, but of spirit." Another case details the use of isolation chambers within the estate, their walls lined with scripture. Such methods suggest a household desperate to reconcile rational science with fears of divine punishment. By 1825, town records confirm the construction of a private wing on the Hartwell Manor, never open to guests. Builders later recalled unusual specifications, windows designed too narrow for escape, staircases that led only upward to dead ends, and doors with locks mounted on the outside. To the townsfolk, it became clear. The Hartwells were building a private asylum, one that kept their affliction hidden under the guise of architectural improvement. But secrecy cannot fully contain unease. Folklore from Ashford Hollow began to weave the Hartwells into cautionary tales. Children were warned to avoid the manor woods at dusk, lest they hear the Hartwell laughter carried on the wind. Midwives whispered that any child born with a birthmark on the temple was marked like a Hartwell, destined for madness. Even respectable townsmen, dependent on Hartwell patronage, admitted in private letters that they feared the family's presence at church pews, silent, stiff-backed, their eyes unfocused, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Perhaps the most damning account comes from probate records in 1839, when the estate of Samuel Hartwell was contested. Witnesses testified that Samuel's last months were plagued by delusions of an ancestor who stood at his bedside every night, whispering orders. His will, drawn in a trembling hand, left significant sums not to heirs, but to those who shall keep the voices at bay. The court dismissed such clauses as incoherent, yet the redistribution of the estate left bitterness among branches of the family. More tellingly, it reinforced the sense that wealth itself was tangled with the family's shadowed inheritance, both sustaining and concealing it. By the mid-19th century, the Hartwell bloodline was a paradox, celebrated benefactors of Ashford Hollow's progress, yet privately bound to madness that stretched back to the first patriarch. The records we have, court filings, medical notes, private diaries, form only fragments of a larger mosaic, one deliberately obscured by the family's own hand. But even through redaction and silence, a pattern emerges. Affliction was their true inheritance, and concealment their only shield. As we continue deeper into their story, one truth becomes clear. The Hartwell lineage was not merely touched by misfortune. It was steeped in shadows that grew denser with each generation, binding descendants to a legacy they could neither escape nor fully confess. The question remains, was it hereditary madness, a curse, or a pact whispered in some forgotten century? Whatever the origin, the stain upon the Hartwell name could not be erased, only hidden, waiting to surface again. By the 1822, the town of Ashford Hollow had begun to speak in cautious tones about the Hartwell household. No longer were whispers confined to taverns or behind church pews. Physicians, clergymen, and even magistrates, quietly acknowledged that the family's troubles had outgrown the estate's locked rooms. It was during this period that the first Hartwell was committed not to a public institution, but to a place carefully arranged, financed, and shielded from scrutiny. A private asylum built under the family's own patronage. The asylum itself was an imposing structure of brick and iron, constructed on the far edge of the estate's holdings. Though the official deed listed it as a convalescent retreat, locals knew it as the North Wing. Its windows were narrow slits, barred with wrought iron, and the doors were fitted with locks designed by a Boston locksmith who later refused to discuss his commission. Family records describe the building in terms of medical necessity, but surviving testimony from servants paints a more Gothic image: corridors, echoing with cries, chambers heavy with the smell of tinctures and lye, and patients who bore the Hartwell name, kept out of sight from the world that still revered their wealth. The first to be confined was Thomas Hartwell II, grandson of the original patriarch. Parish notes from 1821 describe his condition with chilling brevity. Speech disordered, visions at night, violent when restrained. He had once been groomed to inherit the estate, but by his 30th year, his letters grew incoherent. One surviving scrap, preserved in a probate file, reads, "They speak through the walls. The voices know my blood. They demand continuance." Physicians called it melancholia, with delusional episodes, yet the pattern of his decline mirrored that of earlier kin, restlessness, visions, and eventual outbursts, too severe to conceal. As more family members succumbed, the asylum filled with Hartwell blood. Samuel's daughter Margaret was admitted in 1829, following a public episode at Sunday service when she cried out during the sermon that the pews are filled with ghosts. A decade later, probate ledgers list the confinement of twin brothers, Elias and Edmund, whose obsessions with purity led them to fast until their bodies wasted. Each time, the asylum served as both shield and prison, sparing the family public scandal while ensuring their afflictions were hidden behind brick walls. What makes these records particularly haunting are the surviving case notes of Dr. Amos Willoughby, retained as the Hartwell's private physician. His journals, discovered a century later in a trunk at the Worcester Historical Society, reveal both clinical detail and unsettling moral conflict. In one entry, dated 1832, he writes, "The girl Margaret believes herself haunted by the unborn. She weeps for children she has not borne, naming them as if they stand beside her bed. I cannot persuade her otherwise. The family insists upon treatments of bleeding and prayer, yet I fear these worsen her decline." Another note, penned after a midnight visitation, records the physician's unease. "The cries in the ward do not cease. They seem to echo, even when the mouths that made them lie silent. It is as though the building itself remembers." These hints of something more than mere illness echo throughout the asylum years. Servants dismissed from duty later testified in depositions that the afflicted Hartwells often spoke in unison, repeating phrases none could explain. One chambermaid swore under oath that she heard Elias and Edmund chant a litany in a language she did not recognize, though neither had any schooling in foreign tongues. When questioned, the Hartwell patriarch of the time insisted these were the inventions of hysterical staff, but the pattern of reports from different individuals lends them weight. Meanwhile, the asylum's very presence began to warp Ashford Hollow. Local children dared each other to approach its barred windows at dusk, claiming to hear laughter that turned to screams. Farmers working nearby fields complained of dreams filled with Hartwell faces, pale and gaunt, staring from the shadows of the North Wing. Though many dismissed such accounts as superstition, the town's collective unease grew. By the 1842, the phrase "sent to the wing" had entered local vocabulary as a euphemism for both madness and shame. Yet even as confinement increased, the Hartwell family's influence only deepened. Their wealth from mills and shipping lines ensured that officials overlooked irregularities. County inspectors, tasked with reviewing conditions at private asylums, filed reports that were curiously vague: adequate provisions, humane management. But marginalia, in one inspector's notebook, later discovered among his descendants' papers, offers a truer picture. Rooms cold, restraints evident, family members treated as dangerous rather than ill. But to write thus is to invite ruin. The Hartwells must be placated. The asylum years did more than conceal individual tragedies. They institutionalized silence. Generations of Ashford Hollow residents grew accustomed to knowing that behind the walls of the North Wing, Hartwell heirs languished unseen. No funerals were held for those who died there. Instead, coffins were delivered under cover of night to the family plot, their headstones bearing only initials and dates. Townsfolk whispered of carriages rattling down the lane at midnight, bearing new patients whose names were never spoken aloud again. Looking back, historians see in this period a chilling transformation. What began as scattered afflictions had become a system, a mechanism by which the Hartwells preserved their public dignity at the cost of their kin's humanity. The asylum became less a place of treatment and more a mausoleum for the living, where those marked by the bloodline were entombed, while their relatives feasted, worshipped, and conducted business in the daylight world. The true legacy of the asylum years lies not only in the medical files and bricked-up wards, but in the way silence bled outward into the community. Ashford Hollow learned to look away, to treat the cries from the North Wing as if they were part of the wind. And the Hartwells themselves grew skilled in maintaining a dual existence, pillars of society on the outside, keepers of shadows within. The question that remains, as we sift through fragmented records and whispered recollections, is whether the asylum contained a sickness of the mind or whether it contained something older, darker, that fed on confinement itself. For every brick laid in the walls of the North Wing, there seems to echo a deeper truth. The Hartwell bloodline was not merely touched by madness, it was built to sustain it. The asylum years were only the beginning, a prelude to the greater horrors that would follow. The Hartwell Manor was a labyrinth. From its sweeping front steps and stately columns, it appeared to be a model of Georgian elegance, orderly, symmetrical, dignified. But inside, the corridors twisted with additions made over generations, each patriarch building over the bones of the last. By the mid-19th century, visitors began to notice oddities: staircases that climbed only to meet a wall, doorways bricked in with fresh mortar, wings that appeared on early blueprints yet vanished in later versions. These were not renovations in the usual sense. They were erasures, deliberate and unsettling, and the townsfolk came to call them the locked rooms. Accounts from servants who worked within the house tell of doors kept sealed at all hours. Some were ordinary chambers, bedrooms, libraries, storage spaces, yet each had been transformed into a prison. Bolts fixed to the outside of the frames confirmed their purpose: to keep something, or someone, within. Household staff recalled carrying trays of food down hushed corridors, leaving them outside doors, from which sobbing or muttering could be heard. When the trays were retrieved, they were often empty, yet no one ever glimpsed the occupants. To speak of these duties was forbidden, and servants who asked too many questions were promptly dismissed. A carpenter named Elias Brooks, employed briefly in 1842 to repair a section of the East Wing, later gave sworn testimony during a labor dispute that still survives in county records. He described discovering a locked door with no key provided, and hearing a rhythmic tapping from within. When he inquired, a Hartwell steward ordered him to leave the work unfinished, insisting that some rooms are not meant to be disturbed. Brooks confessed that the sound haunted him for weeks. Always 3 taps followed by a pause, as though someone or something was signaling from the other side. Blueprints of the manor, preserved in the archives of a Boston architectural firm, confirm that certain wings were designed with peculiar specifications. In one section, narrow chambers are aligned in a row, each with only a single small window placed high against the ceiling, too small for an adult to climb through. The walls were reinforced with oak beams, unusual for interior construction, and in some cases lined with iron fittings. The architectural notes describe them blandly as quiet rooms, but the implications are darker. Such features are consistent with 19th-century confinement wards, not family residences. The most chilling evidence comes from an 1857 diary kept by a governess, Eliza Crawford, who briefly served the family before resigning under mysterious circumstances. In her entries, later recovered by her descendants, she wrote of being instructed never to allow the Hartwell children to play near the north wing of the house. She noted that one evening, while searching for a missing toy, she stumbled upon a locked door from behind, which a child's voice whispered her name. When she returned with a steward, the hallway was dark and silent, and she was sternly warned to keep to her appointed duties. Within a week, she left the household, writing in her diary that the air in that wing is thick with grief, as if sorrow itself had been sealed into the walls. What lay behind the locked rooms remains uncertain, but the rumors were persistent. Some claimed the Hartwells confined their afflicted kin there rather than sending them to the asylum, believing blood should not be exposed to public institutions. Others whispered of experiments, rituals meant to purge the bloodline of its madness, carried out in secret chambers where cries could not escape. More than one visitor reported hearing sounds that did not resemble human voices at all. Low murmurs, like chanting, punctuated by sudden shrieks that rattled chandeliers in distant halls. For the townsfolk of Ashford Hollow, the locked rooms became part of local legend. Children dared each other to approach the manor and place an ear to the shutters, hoping to hear the cries within. Farmers working nearby fields spoke of lights flickering behind bricked-up windows, as though lanterns still burned in rooms officially abandoned. The church sexton claimed to have seen figures at night pacing in upper-story windows long since sealed with mortar. Such tales blurred the line between superstition and testimony, but they share one unsettling truth. The Hartwell house was alive with secrets, and those secrets pressed against the walls. There is a curious absence of official records concerning the locked rooms. Inspectors sent to review the manor during property disputes mention nothing of them, as if the subject had been carefully excised. Probate files, too, list certain rooms as storage or unused, though inventories describe furniture that suggests occupancy. The silences are as telling as the surviving evidence. When an entire community knows of screams in the night, yet not a single official report acknowledges them, one must ask, who ensured that silence? Historians piecing together the fragments see the locked rooms not as anomalies, but as part of a larger system of concealment. The Hartwells had the wealth to build their own asylum and the influence to suppress scandal, but within their own walls they practiced an even older method: isolation, erasure, and silence. Madness did not leave the manor. It was bricked in, generation after generation, its cries muffled but never extinguished. By the dawn of the Civil War, the north and east wings of the manor stood largely deserted in appearance, their windows shuttered, their corridors unlit. But neighbors swore that on winter nights, when snow muffled the town and the wind carried sound more sharply, faint cries could still be heard from the direction of the estate. Some claimed it was the wailing of those long dead. Others insisted the rooms still held occupants, unseen, forgotten even by their own kin. Whatever the truth, the locked rooms of the Hartwell Manor became both a physical and symbolic prison, a reminder that beneath the polished veneer of wealth, the family's most enduring inheritance was silence, sealed behind doors that no key was ever meant to open. The history of the Hartwell family can be read like a ledger columns of land purchases, marriages, inheritances. But beneath those tidy entries lies another record, one written not in ink but in blood. Madness did not strike the Hartwells at random. It threaded itself through the family tree like a dark vein, appearing predictably, almost rhythmically, as if the affliction were not illness at all, but a legacy handed down with each generation. Medical historians who have combed through scattered documents note a pattern. Every second or third branch of the Hartwell line bore individuals marked by instability. These were not vague eccentricities, but documented episodes of mania, paranoia, and delusion so severe they required confinement. The Worcester Asylum registers, heavily redacted but not entirely silent, lists 3 Hartwell patients between 1830 and 1870, each admitted under guardianship orders signed by relatives. Their names are reduced to initials TH, MH, and EH, yet the family's prominence makes their identities unmistakable. Within the manor itself, the inheritance of affliction was whispered of with dread. Diaries from neighboring families record conversations in which Hartwells admitted their fear of childbirth. One cousin wrote in 1848, "They pray for sons who will be sound of mind, but always there is the chance of another shadowed child." Midwives recalled mothers who clutched their newborns with both relief and terror, scrutinizing the infant for signs of the bloodline's curse. Sometimes those signs appeared early, a child who screamed through the night in voices too mature for its years, or who muttered to invisible companions. At other times, the descent came late, when a promising youth collapsed into hallucination in their 20s, or a matronly aunt succumbed to muteness and terror after decades of apparent health. The family's obsession with bloodline purity grew from this fear. Court filings from inheritance disputes reveal clauses that forbade marriage outside certain social circles. Wills warned heirs against alliances that might further corrupt our line. Yet, ironically, it was often the Hartwells' insistence on intermarriage with cousins and distant kin that may have intensified their inherited affliction. Modern genealogists, tracing the family tree, see unmistakable signs of consanguinity. Marriages contracted to preserve wealth that also preserved disease. Still, the Hartwells clung to their illusion of control. They spoke of the affliction as a moral failing rather than a medical one, insisting that strict discipline and religious devotion could curb its course. A Hartwell son, who raved of unseen figures, was not ill, they claimed, but sinful, and so he was locked in prayer rooms until his voice broke from chanting psalms. A daughter who drifted into melancholy was chastised for idleness. Her shutters opened to the light, as though sunshine alone might banish despair. When such measures failed, silence followed the afflicted removed from public life, their names spoken only in hushed tones, their portraits quietly turned to face the wall. But the silence could not blot out every trace. In 1861, a probate dispute following the death of Ezra Hartwell revealed testimony from a cousin who claimed the family line was tainted. He spoke of brothers who wandered the halls at night, speaking with ancestors as if they stood beside them, and of sisters who cut symbols into their own skin, declaring it protection from voices that commanded them. Though the court dismissed his words as bitter invention, the record remains a rare glimpse of what the Hartwells strove to bury. The inheritance of affliction manifested not only in individuals, but in the very culture of the family. Their gatherings grew increasingly insular, their rituals rigid. At holiday feasts, neighbors noted an unnatural solemnity, as if every gesture was carefully rehearsed. One visitor described a dinner where each toast was echoed word for word by several members, their tones identical, their expressions vacant. To him, it seemed like mimicry, but to the Hartwells it was tradition, a way of binding the family together against the fractures within. The servants, who witnessed more than most, carried tales into the town. They spoke of generations repeating the same phrases as though compelled, of children drawing the same strange symbols in their primers year after year, though none had been taught them. One maid swore that each newborn bore a faint red mark at the base of the skull, a Hartwell sign that she believed heralded the madness to come. Whether superstition or observation, such claims only deepened the town's unease. To outsiders, the Hartwell legacy was paradoxical. Their wealth built schools and mills, yet their bloodline rotted in secret. Publicly, they presented heirs polished and educated, while privately, they watched for cracks in the mine. Some branches of the family fled Ashford Hollow entirely, changing their names in hopes of escaping the inheritance. Yet, even these exiles were not spared. Letters discovered in a New York archive reveal a descendant who begged his brother to watch the children closely, for already I see in them the Hartwell stare. By the close of the 19th century, the affliction had become the family's unspoken heritage. It was as sure as the passing of land, as inevitable as the reading of a will. Some tried to rationalize it as madness carried in the blood, others as a curse that punished the family for forgotten sins. Whatever its source, the inheritance shaped their every decision: whom they married, how they raised their children, how they hid their dead. The Hartwell bloodline thus became both a fortune and a prison. Their riches secured their place in society, but their inheritance bound them to shadows that deepened with every generation. In Ashford Hollow, it was said that a Hartwell could never truly choose their fate. The estate, the name, the wealth, these were inherited. But so too was the affliction, as constant and inescapable as the family crest carved above the manor gates. And though they bricked up rooms, burned letters, and silenced servants, the truth seeped through the cracks. Madness was not an intruder in the Hartwell line. It was their birthright. The most haunting accounts of the Hartwell bloodline do not come from physicians, court ledgers, or the guarded prose of parish records. They come from the mouths of children, fragments preserved in letters, orphanage registers, and the journals of those who escaped the manor's orbit. Their testimonies, though often dismissed in their time as childish fancy, ring with a clarity that cuts through the Hartwells' carefully maintained silence. Children saw what adults explained away. They spoke without guile, and in doing so, they revealed the shadows at the heart of the family. In 1854, a 10-year-old ward named Clara was taken in by the Ashford Hollow orphanage after the sudden death of her parents, distant cousins of the Hartwells. Among the papers filed with her admission is a short statement recorded by the matron. The girl cries in her sleep, muttering of rooms that breathe. She says her family told her never to look at the door with the black handle. When she did, she heard her own name whispered back. Clara repeated this story until her death decades later, insisting that the Hartwell estate contained a chamber that knew her voice. Another testimony, preserved in the diary of Reverend Jonas Pritchard, describes a visit to the manor in 1862. He was called to counsel 3 Hartwell children after their mother fell ill. In his diary, Pritchard wrote, "The eldest, a boy of perhaps 12, informed me in a solemn tone that the sickness was not his mother's, but the family's. He said it passed through their blood like a river, feeding on those it chose. His sister, no older than 8, told me she sometimes woke to see the family at the foot of her bed, though only her brothers were present. When I asked which family she meant, she replied, 'The ones who came before. They tell me things father says I must never repeat.' Servants' recollections reinforce these eerie claims. One nursemaid, dismissed in 1871, later testified in a civil dispute that the children she tended often spoke of games that mimicked ritual. She described girls drawing circles in chalk on the nursery floor and boys lying down within them, chanting words too complex for their age. They called it the remembering, the nursemaid said. When she reported this to the house steward, he warned her never to mention it again. Days later, she was dismissed without reference. Perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from letters written by an adolescent named Henry, sent to a cousin in Boston around 1880. The letters, preserved in the cousin's estate, reveal a boy both terrified and resigned. In one, Henry wrote, "We are taught that the voices are our inheritance. I hear them at night behind the walls. Sometimes they sound like father, sometimes like grandfather. Though both sleep, they tell me I will not live long unless I obey. My sister says she dreams of coffins with our names, and each morning one more appears." His final letter breaks off mid-sentence, as though interrupted. Within months, Henry's name disappears from family documents, no death date recorded. Local lore carried echoes of these children's words into the town. Playmates, invited to the manor for lessons or parties, often returned unsettled. One girl told her parents that a Hartwell child had shown her a locked cabinet, whispering, "That's where they keep the names of the ones who forgot who they were." Another boy claimed his host insisted they bury dolls in the orchard, so the family underground could have company. Parents dismissed these stories as childish inventions, yet the consistency of such accounts across decades suggests otherwise. Orphanage records provide further fragments. In 1893, two Hartwell cousins were placed under the care of the county after their parents' deaths. Both children were described as nervous, prone to visions. The elder refused to sleep indoors, insisting that walls remember and whisper. The younger startled staff by reciting, in flawless Latin, a prayer she could not have been taught at her age. When asked where she learned it, she answered simply, "The house taught me." Historians reviewing these testimonies note the striking pattern. Children spoke not of individual illness, but of inheritance. They described the affliction as something passed along deliberately, like heirlooms or land. Unlike adults, who framed the madness as shame or disease, the children perceived it as instruction. They believed the walls, the rooms, and the blood itself were teachers, and that obedience was the price of survival. To dismiss these accounts as childish fantasy is tempting, yet they echo too closely with adult records, guardianship filings, asylum notes, the strange architectural features of the manor. The children may not have understood what they witnessed, but they gave it voice, stripped of the euphemisms that masked it elsewhere. Their words form a chorus, one that warns of a family where youth itself was not a season of innocence, but the first initiation into madness. The children's testimonies remind us that the Hartwell curse was not only suffered, it was learned, spoken, and passed down. Each generation of Hartwell children grew up in rooms where silence pressed on the walls, where whispers seemed to come from the very stone, and where the line between imagination and inheritance was blurred beyond recognition. Through their eyes, we glimpse the raw truth of the bloodline, that madness was not merely endured by the Hartwells, it was cultivated, absorbed, and remembered by the youngest among them. And as those children grew or vanished, their testimonies became warnings that the affliction was not an accident of fate. It was a legacy, whispered into cradles, etched into play, and sealed within the locked rooms of the manor itself. From the mid-19th century onward, the Hartwell family stood at the uneasy crossroads of medicine and faith. Doctors were summoned in the night, their carriages crunching down the gravel drives, while priests arrived in daylight, their vestments catching the wary eyes of neighbors. Both were called to the manor under the guise of healing, yet both left, changed, muted, reluctant to speak, and bound to the same silence that seemed to hang over the Hartwells like a shroud. The interplay between physician and priest in these years is central to understanding how the Hartwells maintained their facade. For every diagnosis written in clinical ink, there was a counterweight of prayer whispered in candlelit halls. And for every attempt at explanation, there was an equal insistence that what plagued the family lay beyond mortal comprehension. The medical records that survive are fragmentary, often tucked into unrelated files. One physician, Dr. Amos Willoughby, kept meticulous notes during his tenure with the family in the 1,830 seconds, only for many of them to vanish after his death. What remains paints a disturbing picture. He described patients exhibiting symptoms of paranoia, mania, and sudden collapse into stupor. Yet woven through his observations are uneasy concessions to the unexplainable. In one entry he wrote, "Patient exhibits convulsions not preceded by fever nor head trauma. Seizures come precisely at midnight and subside with the first chime of the hour. I cannot explain this by any known physiology." His frustration is palpable, but so too is his fear. Doctors who came after him found their authority eroded by the family's reliance on ritual. In 1859, Dr. Thomas Radcliffe was summoned to treat a Hartwell matron who had lapsed into mutism. Radcliffe recommended stimulants and isolation. Yet when he returned the following week, he found her chamber filled with lit candles, the scent of frankincense clinging to the curtains. A local priest had been called, and the woman's silence was declared not an illness but a spiritual trial. Radcliffe's recommendations were ignored. His only surviving letter about the case ends curtly. "My science is not wanted in that house. They seek sanctity, not remedy." The priests, for their part, left equally conflicted accounts. Parish ledgers show that clergy were often dispatched to the manor for special devotions, a phrase never used for ordinary parishioners. Reverend Isaac Clark, whose ministry in Ashford Hollow ended abruptly in 1863, hinted in his journals that what he encountered among the Hartwells lay beyond the reach of liturgy. He described children who knew entire psalms without ever attending catechism, and rooms that smelled of burning even when no flame was present. In one entry he wrote, "I felt the prayers leave my lips, but I am not certain they rose any higher than the rafters." Months later, he was reassigned to a distant parish. His sermons about sins of the blood abruptly silenced. It is clear that both doctors and priests were drawn into a system larger than themselves. Each approached the affliction from their own discipline, but both found their conclusions undermined. Physicians who pressed too hard were dismissed. Priests who warned too boldly were relocated. Their silence was not voluntary, it was enforced by the Hartwells' wealth and influence. Payments were made, reputations secured, and inconvenient voices quietly removed. Yet, fragments of their unease seeped through the cracks. In Boston, medical journals of the 1,870 anonymous case reports describe a family of standing in central Massachusetts, afflicted by hereditary mania. The details generations of confinement, sudden outbursts at midnight, obsessions with ancestry are unmistakably Hartwell. Likewise, church archives contain veiled references to houses of torment within prosperous parishes, where clergy were commanded to pray without inquiry. The convergence of these two bodies of testimony, medical and clerical, suggests a struggle not only within the family, but within the very institutions meant to guide them. The townspeople of Ashford Hollow observed this tug-of-war with unease. They saw the doctors arrive and leave pale-faced. They saw the priests hurry into the manor and emerge shaken. For the community, it confirmed what they had long suspected, that the Hartwell affliction was both illness and curse, demanding remedies of flesh and spirit alike, yet yielding to neither. Children whispered that the doctors carried away pieces of the patients in their bags. Adults muttered that priests buried holy water in the orchard to keep the soil from turning sour. Though unverifiable, these stories reflect the collective sense that the family's darkness confounded every tool of reason and faith. By the end of the century, silence had become the unspoken contract. Doctors ceased publishing, even veiled reports. Priests ceased writing of their doubts. Both professions recognized that to question the Hartwells was to risk not only their positions, but their sanity. A physician who attended the family in 1892 wrote one final note in his private journal before burning his papers. "I am not sure whether I treated disease or bore witness to inheritance. I only know that I do not wish to remember." The Hartwells, through money and menace, ensured this silence persisted, but the very need for such concealment reveals how deep the affliction ran. If medicine could not cure it, and faith could not banish it, then what remained was only endurance, a family bricking up rooms, suppressing records, and compelling others to look away. Doctors, priests, and silence. Together they formed the unholy trinity that sustained the Hartwell bloodline through the 19th century. As we move deeper into their story, it becomes clear that the true horror lies not only in the affliction itself, but in the collusion it inspired. Those tasked with healing and guiding souls became instruments of silence, their authority bent to the will of a family determined to bury its own secrets. And so the legacy continued, passed from chamber to chamber, whispered in corridors thick with incense and ether, its roots untouched by scalpel or sermon alike. Graveyards tell truths that paper cannot. The Hartwell family, with its redacted ledgers and vanished testimonies, tried to bury its story in ink, but the soil of Ashford Hollow preserved what parchment would not. Over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, evidence surfaced not in the manor's locked rooms, nor in the asylum's wards, but beneath the earth itself. Each discovery revealed how the Hartwells used death as another instrument of silence, yet how death itself betrayed them. The earliest anomaly was noted in 1837, when a county surveyor mapped the family cemetery for taxation purposes. His sketches, still preserved in Worcester archives, show plots without headstones, neat rows broken by sudden gaps. In his notes, he puzzled over the absence of records. "There are burials here, but the names are not marked. The soil is uneven. The the ground freshly turned, though no service was ever recorded. From that moment forward, whispers began, that the Hartwells interred their afflicted not with dignity, but in secret, their graves left blank, so the family line appeared untarnished to the outside world. By the 1,850 seconds, gravediggers themselves added testimony. An anonymous account published decades later in a local pamphlet claimed that some Hartwell coffins were delivered at night, the lids nailed shut with unusual haste. In one chilling recollection, a digger swore the coffin he lowered into the earth was lighter than it should have been, as if the body within were scarcely more than bones. Others told of faint odors of medicine or burned herbs seeping from the wood, the same scents later identified with the manor's private infirmary. Such details suggest that the family was not merely concealing deaths, but perhaps concealing the means by which those deaths occurred. Archaeological confirmation arrived much later, in the 1,920 seconds, when storms eroded part of the cemetery hill. 3 unmarked graves collapsed into view. Local historians who examined the remains found iron restraints still clamped to the bones of 2 individuals, shackles at the wrists and ankles, corroded but unmistakable. The third skeleton bore grooves on the skull consistent with surgical intrusion, as if trepanation had been attempted. No public record exists of these individuals, yet their remains testify to confinement and crude experimentation. The discovery was quickly suppressed. The Hartwells, though diminished in wealth, still had enough influence to seal the site. But photographs survive, hidden in historical society files, their grainy, black and white images showing the chains that anchored the family's silence. Even more disturbing are the discrepancies between parish death records and burial plots. Between 1840 and 1870, at least 11 Hartwells are listed as deceased, but only 5 corresponding gravestones exist. The missing 6 have no marked resting places. In one case, a matriarch named Lydia Hartwell is recorded as having died of consumption in 1856, yet no stone commemorates her. Oral tradition insists she was buried not in consecrated ground, but in a shallow grave near the orchard wall, so her voice would not disturb the family. When researchers tested soil near that area, in the 1,970 seconds, they discovered high concentrations of lime commonly used in the 19th century to hasten decomposition. Letters from a former servant, unearthed in a private collection, describe still more grotesque practices. Writing in 1881, the servant claimed that certain afflicted Hartwells were never buried whole. "I carried jars down to the cellar." The letter reads, "Glass vessels sealed with wax, each containing parts taken from the dead. They told me it was for study, for remembrance, but I believe it was something darker." The description aligns chillingly with preserved specimens, later rumored to have been found in hidden chambers of the manor brains, suspended in cloudy fluid, labeled only with initials. If true, then burial for the Hartwells was not only concealment, but division. Bodies fragmented, parts interred in secrecy, while remnants were hoarded in laboratories. Folklore kept pace with these discoveries. Townsfolk avoided the family cemetery, insisting that the ground there was restless. Children told stories of hearing muffled cries when passing at dusk, as though the earth itself had not fully sealed what lay within. Hunters claimed to see faint lantern light drifting among the stones, though no caretaker lived nearby. One tale, passed from generation to generation, spoke of a tree that grew crooked over an unmarked grave, its branches twisted as if recoiling from the soil below. The most unsettling revelations, however, come not from the graves themselves, but from what was missing within them. In 1904, during a smallpox epidemic, local authorities attempted to confirm the burial of several Hartwells whose deaths had been reported to the county. When one coffin was exhumed to verify cause of death, it was found empty, filled only with stones. Officials quickly halted the investigation, citing clerical errors. But the story spread rapidly. The Hartwells were staging burials, reporting deaths for kin who were, in fact, locked away within the manor or asylum. This deception would explain the many inconsistencies in census records, where Hartwell numbers shrink and swell without corresponding baptisms or burials. What the buried evidence reveals is that the Hartwell silence was not confined to life, it extended into death. Graves were unmarked, bodies hidden or tampered with, ceremonies abandoned. In trying to erase the signs of madness from their lineage, the Hartwells created a second inheritance, a graveyard of unanswered questions, each plot a riddle of absence or distortion. Their attempts at secrecy only deepened suspicion, ensuring that their name was spoken with dread long after their wealth dwindled. Today, historians who walk the cemetery grounds note the irregular spacing, the stones leaning at unnatural angles, the patches of ground where grass grows thin. The earth itself seems unsettled, as though burdened by the weight of concealment. In the end, the soil of Ashford Hollow remembers what the ledgers tried to forget. Chains rust, stones shift, bones surface, and through them, the truth of the Hartwell bloodline continues to claw its way to light. The buried evidence stands as testimony. No matter how carefully the Hartwells locked their rooms, silenced their doctors, or bribed their priests, the earth refused to keep their secrets forever. By the 1,870 seconds, the whispers surrounding the Hartwell family had swelled into something more dangerous than rumor. They threatened to spill into court. For decades, the family's silence had been enforced with money and influence. But that grip began to loosen when creditors, estranged relatives, and discontented servants pushed their grievances beyond the manor gates. It was in 1874 that the county convened proceedings in Worcester to investigate allegations against the Hartwells' allegations of unlawful confinement, fraudulent estates, and deaths left suspiciously unrecorded. For a brief moment, it seemed the family's secrets might finally be forced into daylight. Yet the event remembered in town lore as the trial that never was proved to be a masterclass in evasion, a performance of justice in which truth was carefully smothered. The case began with a dispute over the will of Ezra Hartwell, whose death in 1872 raised more questions than answers. Probate filings revealed discrepancies. Large sums set aside for guardianship of unnamed heirs, and lands transferred to trustees without clear beneficiaries. Rumors swirled that these funds were being used to maintain the private asylum wing on the estate, where afflicted family members were hidden rather than declared. Two cousins, embittered by their exclusion, petitioned the court, demanding an inquiry into the family's secret dependents. Their claim gained momentum when three former servants stepped forward with sworn affidavits, testifying that certain Hartwells had been locked in upper rooms for years, their existence erased from the public record. Newspapers of the day latched onto the story. The Worcester Gazette published a cautious column in March 1874, noting peculiar inconsistencies in the Hartwell genealogical line and whispering of rooms shuttered against the light. The Boston Evening Transcript went further, calling it a scandal fit to rival Europe's madhouses. For the first time, the Hartwells' carefully tended image as benefactors and patrons was shaken. Townsfolk whispered that justice might finally pry open the doors of the manor. Yet, when the hearings opened, something uncanny unfolded. Testimonies that had seemed damning were suddenly muted, watered down into half-truths. The servants who had once spoken of screams in the night now claimed they had misremembered. One admitted under oath that she had been overcome with nerves and could not distinguish dreams from reality. The cousins' accusations were buried under reams of technical arguments about inheritance law. Court stenographers later confessed that entire sections of testimony were stricken before records went to press. It was as though an invisible hand moved through the courtroom, excising anything that touched the family's true affliction. Behind the scenes, that hand was no mystery. The Hartwells wielded their fortune like a scalpel, cutting away threats with bribes and influence. Judges owed debts to the family's mills, lawyers were retained at exorbitant fees, and witnesses were quietly compensated or intimidated into silence. One surviving letter from a county clerk reveals the pressure directly. "I was told it would be better for my family if I forgot certain papers ever crossed my desk. I did as I was told. Others did too." The machinery of justice was not overturned, it was bought, redirected, made to serve the very people it was meant to judge. Still, fragments of truth leaked through the cracks. A physician, summoned by the court as an expert, testified that he had once treated a Hartwell youth confined under conditions not in keeping with medical ethics. His statement was quickly cut short by objections, and the judge ordered the remark stricken. Yet the words had already been heard. Another witness, a parish priest, admitted reluctantly that he had been called to perform rites of consolation for individuals whose names never appeared in the baptism or burial records. His voice faltered as he spoke, and the court transcript preserves the abrupt notation: witness, overcome, unable to continue. The proceedings dragged on for weeks, but the outcome was foreordained. In June 1874, the case was dismissed for lack of substantiated evidence. Officially, the Hartwells were cleared of wrongdoing, their wealth and reputation intact. Unofficially, the dismissal left behind a residue of unease. Townspeople who had hoped for revelation were instead confronted with silence more suffocating than before. To them, the trial became less a search for justice than a demonstration of how thoroughly truth could be buried under money, influence, and fear. Historians now sift through what scraps remain: partial transcripts with whole passages blacked out, newspaper reports that contradict each other, diaries of attendees who describe being warned not to speak further. From these fragments, a disturbing picture emerges. The trial was never about uncovering the family's crimes. It was about ensuring those crimes never reached daylight. It was theater, staged in a courtroom rather than a parlor, with the audience left unsettled, aware that something had been concealed but powerless to prove it. In Ashford Hollow, the phrase, "the trial that never was," became shorthand for futility. Parents used it to warn their children about speaking too freely. Do you want to end up like those who testified against the Hartwells? The event lingered as a bitter reminder that institutions designed to protect the weak could be bent to shield the powerful. And the Hartwells themselves, far from chastened, seemed to emerge emboldened. Their walls grew higher, their rooms more tightly sealed, as if the courtroom's failure had confirmed that their silence was invincible. The trial that never was remains one of the most chilling chapters in the family's history, not because of what was revealed, but because of what was not. In those muffled testimonies and stricken records lies the measure of the Hartwell influence. Madness had long haunted their bloodline, but here we see how that madness intertwined with law, faith, and power to sustain itself. It was not only the afflicted who were imprisoned, it was the truth itself, locked away in the vaults of silence, never to stand trial. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Hartwell bloodline had thinned to a single branch. Where once the family tree sprawled with cousins, uncles, and children scattered across Ashford Hollow, the limbs had withered, cut away by madness, confinement, or quiet disappearance. Into this narrowing lineage was born Eliza Hartwell in 1891, the last true heiress to the estate. From the beginning, she bore the weight of both expectation and dread. Neighbors whispered that she was a child marked by destiny, born under a blood moon that reddened the October sky. Family servants, more candid in private, called her the final Hartwell, as though the name itself carried a curse she would be forced to embody. Eliza's early years seemed touched by an eerie duality. On one hand, she was precocious, fluent in French before her 10th birthday, musically gifted, her voice rising clear and haunting in the Manor's chapel. On the other, she was prone to spells that unsettled her caretakers. One diary entry from her governess notes, "The child speaks to her reflection as though it were another girl. She insists that the glass holds her sister, who tells her secrets in the night." Such reports multiplied as Eliza grew older. Visitors to the estate recalled her pale composure at dinner, where she would suddenly fall silent, eyes fixed on something unseen, lips moving in inaudible reply. By adolescence, the symptoms could no longer be dismissed as eccentricity. Letters between family physicians, some preserved in Boston archives, describe a pattern of obsessive ritual. Eliza reportedly spent hours tracing the family crest into the dust of the drawing room floor, whispering the names of ancestors she could not have known. Servants told of waking to find her wandering the halls in her nightdress, a lantern in hand, reciting passages from journals she had never been shown. She seems possessed not of one mind, one physician wrote, but of many. What set Eliza apart from her forebears, however, was her awareness. Whereas earlier Hartwell slipped quietly into delusion, Eliza documented her experiences with chilling clarity. Hidden in a trunk, discovered decades later, were notebooks written in her precise hand. In them she catalogued visions of long-dead relatives who stood at her bedside, urging her to keep the bloodline pure. She wrote of dreams in which the manor itself breathed, its walls pulsing with memory, its windows watching her. In one particularly harrowing entry, she confessed, "I feel not alone in my mind. When I look into the mirror, I see my face, but it is crowded with others." By the early 1910 seconds, the town of Ashford Hollow had grown wary of its reclusive heiress. Eliza rarely appeared in public, and when she did, her presence drew unease. Parishioners recalled her at Sunday service, sitting stiffly in the family pew, her eyes glassy, mouthing prayers out of rhythm with the congregation. Children claimed she lingered in the cemetery at dusk, speaking softly to the unmarked graves. One farmer's wife swore she saw Eliza kneeling in the orchard, her hands stained with soil as though she were burying something small. No one dared confront her. The Hartwell fortune, though diminished, still held sway, and the fear of crossing the family remained strong. Eliza never married. Suitors from Boston and Hartford were briefly entertained, but all departed abruptly, some after a single visit. A rumor persisted that one young man fled the estate in terror, claiming Eliza had shown him the family's true inheritance in a locked chamber of the north wing. Whatever he saw, he refused to speak of it, and within months he had left the country altogether. Eliza seemed resigned to her solitude, writing in her notebooks, "The blood must end with me, or else the voices will continue without cease." Her final years were marked by growing isolation and dread. Servants reported that she ceased to eat at the family table, preferring to take her meals alone in her chamber. Neighbors claimed to see only a single window lit in the great manor, its glow burning late into the night. The few who encountered her during this period described a woman consumed by obsession. One account from 1931 recalls Eliza warning a parish priest that the collector waits in the walls, hungry for what remains of us. The priest dismissed her words as blasphemy, but in private correspondence, he admitted to feeling a chill of the grave in her presence. Eliza Hartwell died in 1934 at the age of 43, her body discovered by a maid who found her slumped at her writing desk, surrounded by scattered pages. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but her notebooks tell a more unsettling story. Her final entry reads simply, "Tonight the voices call for the last time. If I do not answer, perhaps they will rest. If I do, then I shall join them." No further explanation is offered. The pages end in mid-sentence, the ink trailing off as though interrupted. At her funeral, only a handful of townsfolk attended. The coffin was lowered into the Hartwell plot beside unmarked graves, the soil quickly packed down, the service short and somber. With her, the bloodline ended. The estate, already crumbling, passed into receivership, its halls abandoned to dust and rumor. Yet even in death, Eliza refused to fade entirely. Her notebooks, preserved by chance, remain the most intimate record of the family's affliction, a testimony not of madness alone, but of awareness, of a woman who saw clearly the curse she carried and chose to end it. The last heiress thus stands as both culmination and epitaph. Eliza Hartwell embodied the silence and shadows of her ancestors, yet unlike them, she recorded her descent, leaving words where others left only whispers. In her final act, whether of defiance or surrender, she ensured that the family's darkness would not continue through children, but through memory. For the people of Ashford Hollow, her death was not release, but reminder that some legacies cannot be buried with the body, and that the soil of the Hartwell estate still holds voices waiting to be heard. Long after the last Hartwell was laid to rest, the family remained alive in the minds of Ashford Hollow. Their manor stood as a husk on the hill, its shuttered windows staring blankly over the town. And in its silence, the townsfolk filled the void with stories. These tales became folklore, half memory, half invention, woven into the daily life of the community, until the Hartwells became less a family than a legend of warning. To speak their name was to summon unease, a reminder that wealth and refinement could mask horrors that defied both medicine and prayer. Children were often the keepers of these stories. Games played in the orchards or alleyways bore Hartwell echoes. One popular dare involved standing at the manor gate after sundown and whispering your name 3 times. The bravest swore they heard it whispered back, faint and mocking. Another game had children trace circles in the dirt, imitating the rituals they had been told the Hartwell children performed in their locked rooms. The older generation scolded them for trifling with curses, yet they too passed down the tales, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as hushed entertainment by the hearth. The town's adults had their own language of superstition. If a child grew sickly or restless at night, it was whispered that the Hartwell blood runs thin nearby. When a neighbor fell into melancholy, it was compared to a Hartwell spell. The phrase, "sent to the wing," survived long after the private asylum had crumbled, shorthand for madness or disgrace. Local midwives, recalling generations of whispered fears, insisted that infants born with a red mark at the nape of the neck carried the Hartwell sign, though none could explain its meaning. In these small ways, the family's legacy permeated the very vocabulary of Ashford Hollow. Folklore crystallized most strongly around the manor itself. By the 1942, the estate had been abandoned, but trespassers returned with stories of lights flickering behind bricked-up windows and voices carrying down empty halls. Some claimed the orchard trees bore fruit that tasted bitter, as if soured by the soil. Others swore that on still nights, the toll of the church bell was echoed faintly by another chime from the manor, though no bell remained inside. Teenagers seeking thrills described seeing pale figures in the windows, their faces blurred, as if layered with the features of multiple people at once. The cemetery, too, became a source of legend. The unmarked Hartwell graves were said to stir after midnight, the earth above them shifting as though unsettled. Farmers reported livestock that refused to graze near the boundary wall, their animals spooked by something unseen. One story told of a gravedigger who, after working too close to the Hartwell plot, returned home muttering in Latin, a language he had never learned, and died within a week. Whether truth or invention, the cemetery stories reinforced the notion that the Hartwells had not rested quietly beneath the soil. Over time, the Hartwells became less a historical family than archetypes of warning. School teachers spoke of them in parables, that pride and secrecy lead to ruin, that unchecked bloodlines can curdle into curses. Ministers, more cautious, avoided naming them from the pulpit but hinted at houses that brought their own damnation. Even the town's folklore festivals intended to celebrate New England's colonial heritage made oblique reference to the Hartwells. Masks of the silent family were worn in parades, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes wide with fear. Children carried lanterns shaped like the manor's barred windows, unaware of the grim reality behind the symbol. Yet within this folklore lies a paradox. The Hartwells, who sought above all to erase their shame through silence, became immortal in the very thing they feared: public memory. Every locked room, every vanished heir, every bricked-up wing grew louder in absence. Where the family hid truth, the town supplied imagination. And imagination, unbound by fact, carried the Hartwells farther than any record ever could. They ceased to be merely a wealthy clan undone by hereditary madness. They became spectral overseers of Ashford Hollow's conscience, reminders that wealth can rot, that silence can scream, and that every town carries secrets buried just beneath its streets. For historians, separating fact from folklore remains nearly impossible. Was Eliza Hartwell truly seen in the cemetery, conversing with unmarked graves? Or did grief-stricken neighbors project their fears? Did the orchard soil truly taste bitter? Or did the stories sour the fruit in memory alone? Yet perhaps this blending is itself the truest testament. The Hartwell's reality was always shrouded by bribes, by silence, by locked doors. Folklore filled the void not with lies, but with reflections of communal dread. Today, the manor lies in ruin, ivy crawling across its facades, timbers sagging. Yet locals still warn travelers not to wander too close at night. The Hartwell story, though fragmented, continues to live in the way only legends can retold in whispers, reshaped by each generation, suspended between history and haunting. In cultural memory, the Hartwells are eternal, their silence louder than any confession, their legacy inseparable from the folklore of Ashford Hollow. The cultural memory of the Hartwells is thus both preservation and distortion. It keeps alive fragments of truth-hidden rooms, unmarked graves, silenced heirs, but cloaks them in the language of curses and specters. For Ashford Hollow, it hardly matters which parts are fact and which are invention. The Hartwells endure, not in the bloodline that ended with Eliza, but in the stories told beside hearths, in playground dares, and in the uneasy glance locals cast at the hill where the manor still stands, its windows forever watching. The Hartwell story ends not with triumph, nor even with resolution, but with an echo, one that still reverberates through the ruins of Ashford Hollow. The family's fortune has long since been divided, their manor left to rot, their last heiress laid beneath unmarked soil. Yet the true inheritance of the Hartwells was never their land or their wealth. It was madness, persistent, hereditary, and carefully concealed, that outlived them all. This legacy of madness is the most enduring monument they left behind, a legacy that bound generations in silence and shaped the memory of an entire town. To trace the Hartwell history is to see a pattern etched deeper than any family crest. Each generation produced its scholars, patrons, and heirs, but alongside them came the afflicted sons who raved at midnight, daughters who spoke to mirrors, mothers who starved themselves under the belief that unseen voices demanded sacrifice. Their wealth allowed them to hide what other families would have been forced to reveal, but concealment was not cure. The asylum wings, the locked rooms, the bricked corridors all became extensions of the family itself, as much Hartwell inheritance as portraits or deeds. Madness was not an intruder in their line, it was the very marrow that bound them. The impact stretched far beyond the walls of the estate. Doctors learned to avert their eyes, priests learned to pray without questions, and townsfolk learned to whisper instead of confront. In this way, the Hartwells' madness infected the wider community, not biologically, but culturally. A whole town came to live under the weight of silence, conditioned to ignore cries that leaked from shuttered windows, conditioned to excuse absences in census records, conditioned to accept the impossible as merely Hartwell business. Their affliction was contagious, not in blood but in habit, teaching everyone around them the art of complicity. The folklore that grew in Ashford Hollow proves how powerfully this legacy endured. Children spoke of Hartwell games, adults avoided Hartwell land, and even generations born after Eliza's death referred to melancholy neighbors as Hartwell touched. These phrases, detached from their original meaning, show how madness became more than medical inheritance. It became a cultural symbol, shorthand for the unexplainable. The family may have vanished, but the pattern of their secrecy lived on, a curse transformed into community memory. For historians, the Hartwells stand as a case study in how families of influence can warp the record of their own decline. Court transcripts were censored, asylum notes destroyed, gravestones left blank. Yet, the very absence of evidence became evidence itself. Gaps in the record pointed to the rooms bricked away, the heirs erased. Madness has a way of seeping through cracks, and in the Hartwell case, those cracks litter every document they tried to seal. In trying to erase their legacy, they only ensured it could never be forgotten. The tragedy of the Hartwells is that many of them seemed aware. Eliza, the last heiress, wrote openly of her visions, confessing that she felt her mind crowded with ancestors demanding continuance. Her notebooks are chilling because they reveal clarity, not confusion. She knew she carried a curse, and she chose to end it by leaving no heirs. In that act, she may have broken the bloodline, but she could not break the legacy. Madness lingered in the soil, in the stories, in the way Ashford Hollow came to define itself against the family on the hill. And so the legacy remains ambiguous, part psychiatric inheritance, part cultural haunting. Was it a genetic disorder passed down through generations of intermarriage? Was it a curse whispered across oceans from some forgotten ancestor? Or was it, more chilling still, the inevitable product of silence madness cultivated by confinement, by secrets, by the weight of expectations no family could bear? Whatever the root, the Hartwells proved that madness, once woven into identity, cannot be easily separated from history. Today the manor still stands in ruin, its walls sagging, its windows black. Ivy creeps across its bricks, but the structure refuses to collapse entirely, as though stubbornly determined to outlast memory itself. Locals still glance at it uneasily. Children dare each other to approach, and historians wander its grounds in search of fragments. No matter how much time passes, the estate embodies the family's legacy, a monument not of wealth, but of silence, secrets, and affliction. The Hartwell bloodline may be gone, but their story endures as a parable, of wealth that could not shield from decay, of silence that became louder than truth, of madness so deeply rooted it became identity. Their legacy is not in the manor's stones, nor in the faded portraits, nor in the forgotten graves. It is in the lesson that darkness, when denied and concealed, does not vanish. It grows. And though the Hartwells are gone, the echo of their madness remains, carried forward in the whispers of Ashford Hollow, a reminder that some legacies do not die, they haunt.